Maggots, too, by this time. Nobody wanted to get...
Liberty Damos, please come to the main office.
Oh, sorry.
Liberty Damos to the main office.
Nobody wanted to get too close to him with the night coming on. I read somewhere, in an Algernon Blackwood story, I think, that a guy's ghost hangs around his dead body until the body's given a decent Christian burial, and there was no way I wanted to wake up in the night and confront the glowing, disembodied ghost of Ray Brower, moaning and gibbering and floating among the dark and rustling pines. By stopping here, we figured there had to be at least 10 miles between us and him, and of course all 4 of us knew there was no such thing as ghosts, but 10 miles seemed just about far enough in case what everybody knew was wrong. Vern, Chris, and Teddy gathered wood and got a modest little campfire going on a bed of cinders. Chris scraped a bare patch all around the fire. The woods were powder dry, and he didn't want to take any chances. While they were doing that, I sharpened some sticks and made what my brother Denny used to call pioneer drumsticks, lumps of hamburger pushed onto the ends of green branches. The 3 of them laughed and bickered over their woodcraft, which was almost nil. There was a Castle Rock Boy Scout troop, but most of the kids who hung around our vacant lot considered it to be an organization made up mostly of pussies. Arguing about whether it was better to cook over flames or over coals, a moot point, we were too hungry to wait for coals, whether dried moss would work as kindling, what they would do if they used up all the matches before they got the fire to stay lit. Teddy claimed he could make fire by rubbing 2 sticks together. Chris claimed he was so full of shit he squeaked. They didn't have to try. Vern got the small pile of twigs and moss to catch from the second match. The day was perfectly still, and there was no wind to puff out the light. We all took turns feeding the thin flames until they began to grow stouter on wrist-thick chunks of wood fetched from an old deadfall some 30 yards into the forest. When the flames began to die back a little bit, I stuck the sticks holding the pioneer drumsticks firmly into the ground at an angle over the fire. We sat around watching them as they shimmered and dripped, and finally began to brown. Our stomachs made pre-dinner conversation. Unable to wait until they were really cooked, we each took one of them, stuck it in a roll, and yanked the hot stick out of the center. They were charred outside, raw inside, and totally delicious. We wolfed them down and wiped the grease from our mouths with our bare arms. Chris opened his pack and took out his tin Band-Aids box. The pistol was away at the bottom of his pack because he hadn't told Vern and Teddy. I guessed it was to be our secret. He opened it and gave each of us a battered Winston. We lit them with the flaming twigs of the fire and then leaned back, men of the world, watching the cigarette smoke drift away into the twilight. None of us inhaled because we might cough, and that would mean a day or 2 of ragging from the others. And it was pleasant enough just to drag and blow, hawking into the fire to hear the sizzle. That was the summer I learned how you can pick out someone who's just learning to smoke. If you're new at it, you spit a lot. We were feeling good. We smoked the Winstons down to the filters and tossed them into the fire. Nothing like a smoke after a meal, Teddy said. Fucking A, Vern agreed. Crickets had started to hum in the green gloom. I looked up at the sky, at the lane of sky visible through the railroad cut, and saw the blue was now bruising toward purple. Seeing the outrider of twilight made me feel sad and calm at the same time. Me, brave, but not really brave, comfortably lonely. We tramped down a flat place in the underbrush beside the embankment and laid out our bedrolls. Then, for an hour or so, we fed the fire and talked. The kind of talk you can never quite remember once you get past 15 and discover girls. We talked about who was the best dragger in Castle Rock, if Boston would maybe stay out of the cellar this year, and about the summer just past. Teddy told about the time he had been at White's Beach in Brunswick, and some kid had hit his head while diving off the float and almost drowned. We discussed at some length the relative merits of the teachers we'd had. We agreed that Mr. Brooks was the biggest pussy in Castle Rock Elementary. He would just about cry if you sassed him back. On the other hand, there was Miss Coate, pronounced Cody. She was just about the meanest bitch God had ever set down on earth. Vern said he'd heard she hit a kid so hard 2 years ago the kid almost went blind. I looked at Chris, wondering if he would say anything about Miss Simons, but he didn't say anything at all, and he didn't see me looking at him. He was looking at Vern and nodding soberly at Vern's story. We didn't talk about Ray Brower as the dark drew down, but I was thinking about him. There's something horrible and fascinating about the way dark comes to the woods. It's coming unsoftened by headlights or streetlights or house lights or neon. its conies with no mothers' voices calling for their kids to leave off and come on in now, to herald it. If you're used to the town, the coming the dark in the woods seems more like a natural disaster than a natural phenomenon. It rises like the Castle River rises in the spring. And as I thought about the body of Ray Brower in this light, or lack of it, what I felt was not queasiness or fear that he would suddenly appear before us, a green and gibbering banshee whose purpose was to drive us back the way we had come before we could disturb its peace, but a sudden and unexpected wash of pity that he should be so alone and so defenseless in the dark that was now coming over our side of the earth. If something wanted to eat him, it would. His mother wasn't here to stop that from happening, and neither was his father nor Jesus Christ and all the company of the saints. He was dead, and he was all alone, flung off the railroad tracks and into the ditch, and I realized that if I didn't stop thinking about it, I was going to cry. So I told a Lee Dio story, made up on the spot and not very good, and when it ended, as most of my Lee Dio stories did, with one lone American dog face coughing out a dying declaration of patriotism and love for the girl back home into the sad and wise face of the platoon sergeant. It wasn't the white, scared face of some PFC from Castle Rock or White River Junction I saw in my mind's eye, but the face of a much younger boy, already dead, his eyes closed, his features troubled, a rill of blood running from the left corner of his mouth to his jawline. And in back of him, instead of the shattered shops and churches of my Lee Dio dreamscape, I saw only dark forest and cindered railway bed bulking against the starry sky like a prehistoric burial mound. 19. I came awake in the middle of the night disoriented, wondering why it was so chilly in my bedroom and who had left the windows open. Denny, maybe. I had been dreaming of Denny, something about body surfing at Harrison State Park, but it had been 4 years ago, and we had done that. This wasn't my room. This was someplace else. Somebody was holding me in a mighty bear hug. Somebody else was pressed against my back, and a shadowy third was crouched beside me, head cocked and listening, and in a listening attitude. What the fuck, I asked in honest puzzlement. A long, drawn-out groan in answer. It sounded like Vern. That brought things into focus, and I remember where I was. But what was everybody doing awake in the middle of the night? Or had I only been asleep for seconds? No, that couldn't be, because a thin sliver of moon was floating dead center in an inky sky. Don't let it get me, Vern gibbered. I swear I'll be a good boy. I won't do nothing bad. I'll put the ring up before I take a piss. I'll... With some astonishment, I realized that I was listening to a prayer, or at least the Vern Tasayo equivalent of a prayer. I sat bolt upright, scared. Chris? Shut up, Vern, Chris said. He was the one crouching and listening. It's nothing. Oh, yes, it is, Teddy said ominously. It's something. What is? I asked. I was still sleepy and disoriented, unstrung from my place in space and time. It scared me that I had come in late on whatever had developed, too late to defend myself properly, maybe. Then, as if to answer my question, a long and hollow scream rose languidly from the woods. It was the sort of scream you might expect from a woman dying in extreme agony and extreme fear. Oh, dear Jesus, Vern whimpered, his voice high and filled with tears. He reapplied the bear hug that had wakened me. It made it hard for me to breathe, and adding to my own terror, I threw him loose with an effort, but he scrambled back beside me like a puppy, which can't think of any place to go. It's that Brower kid, Teddy whispered hoarsely. His ghost's out walking in the woods. Oh, God, Vern screamed, apparently not crazy about that idea at all. I promise I won't hawk no more dirty books at a Daly's market. I promise I won't give my carrots to the dog no more. He floundered there, wanting to bribe God with everything, but unable to think of anything really good in the extremity of his fear. I won't smoke no more unfiltered cigarettes. I won't say no bad swears. I won't put my bazooka in the Afrin plate. I won't... Shut up, Vern, Chris said. And beneath his usual authoritative toughness, I could hear the hollow boom of awe. I wondered if his arms and back and belly were stiff with goose flesh as my own were, and if the hair on the nape of his neck was trying to stand up in hackles, as mine was. Vern's voice dropped to a whisper as he continued to expand the reforms he planned to institute if God would only let him live through this night. It's a bird, isn't it? I asked Chris. No, at least I don't think so. I think it's a wildcat. My dad says they scream bloody murder, when they're getting ready to mate. Sounds like a woman, doesn't it? Yeah, I said. My voice hitched in the middle of the word, and 2 ice cubes broke off in the gap. But no woman could scream like that, Chris said, and then added helplessly, could she, Gordy? It's his ghost, Teddy whispered again. His eyeglasses reflected the moonlight in weak, somehow dreamy smears. I'm going to go look for it. I don't think he was serious, but we took no chances. When he started to get up, Chris and I hauled him back down. Perhaps we were too rough with him, but our muscles had been turned into cables with fear. Let me up, fuckheads, Teddy hissed, struggling. If I say I want to go look for it, then I'm going to look for it. I want to see it. I want to see the ghost. I want to see it. The wild, sobbing cry rose into the night again, cutting the air like a knife with a crystal blade, freezing us with our hands on Teddy. If he'd been a flag, we would have looked at that picture of the Marines claiming Iwo Jima. The scream climbed with a crazy ease through octave after octave, finally reaching a glassy, freezing edge. It hung there for a moment and then whirled back down again, disappearing into an impossible bass register that buzzed like a monstrous honeybee. This was followed by a burst of what sounded like a mad laughter, and then there was silence again. Jesus H. bald-headed Christ, Teddy whispered, and he talked no more of going into the woods to see what was making that screaming noise. All 4 of us huddled up together, and I thought of running. I doubt if I was the only one. If we'd been tending up in Vern's Field, where our folks thought we were, we probably would have run. But Castle Rock was too far, and the thought of trying to run across that trestle in the dark made my blood freeze. Running deeper into Harlow and closer to the corpse, of Ray Brower was equally unthinkable. We were stuck. If there was a haunt out there in the woods, what my dad called a goosalum, and it wanted us, it probably would get us. Chris proposed we keep guard, and everyone was agreeable to that. We flipped for watches, and Vern got the first one. I got the last. Vern sat up cross-legged by the husk of the campfire, while the rest of us lay down again. We huddled together like sheep. I was positive that sleep would be impossible, but I did sleep, a light, uneasy sleep that skimmed through the unconsciousness like a sub with its periscope up. My half-sleeping dreams were populated with wild cries that might have been real or might have been products of my imagination. I saw, or thought I saw, something white and shapeless steal through the trees like a grotesquely ambulatory bedsheet. At last, I slipped into something I knew was a dream. Chris and I were swimming at White's Beach, a gravel pit in Brunswick that had been turned into a miniature lake when the gravel diggers struck water. It was where Teddy had seen that kid hit his head and almost drown. In my dream, we were out over our heads, stroking lazily along, with a hot July sun blazing down. From behind us on the float came cries and shouts and yells of laughter as kids climbed and dived or climbed and were pushed. I could hear the empty kerosene drum that held the float up clanging and booming together, a sound not unlike that of church bells, which were so solemn and emptily profound. On the sand and gravel beach, oiled bodies lay face down on blankets. Little kids with buckets squatted on the verge of the water or sat happily flipping muck into their hair with plastic shovels, and teenagers, clustered in grinning groups, watched the young girls promenade endlessly back and forth in pairs and trios, never alone, the secret places of their bodies wrapped in Jansen tank suits. People walked up the hot sand on the balls of their feet, wincing to the snack bar. They came back with chips, devil dogs, red ball popsicles. Mrs. Cody drifted past us in an inflatable rubber raft. She was lying on her back, dressed in her typical September to June school uniform, a gray two-piece suit with thick sweater instead of a blouse under the jacket, a flower pin over one almost non-existent breast, thick support hose on the color of Canada mints on her legs. Her black old lady high heel shoes were trailing in the water, making small V's. Her hair was blue rinsed like my mother's and done up in those tight medicinal-smelling clock spring curls. Her glasses flashed brutally in the sun. "Watch your steps, boys," she said. "Watch your steps or I'll hit you hard enough to strike you blind. I can do that. I've been given the power by the school board. Now, Mr. Chambers, Mendingwall, if you please, by rote." "I tried to give the money back," Chris said. "Old Lady Simon said okay, but she took it. Do you hear me? She took it. Now what are you going to do about it? Are you going to whack her blind?" "Mendingwall, Mr. Chambers, if you please, by rote." Chris threw